So hi everyone, so welcome to this week's Thursday 30 on supporting AAC to reflect language and culture in schools with David Baines from Global Systems. Just a polite reminder to keep your microphones on mute and you can turn your camera off if you want to. Thank you. And please post any questions in the chat or keep them at the end. Great. So David, over to you.
Thanks very much. And I promise to try to stick to 30 minutes. Being succinct is not my natural style, but I will do my very best, I promise. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of language and culture, particularly on symbol design and choice of symbols that you might be using for AAC. We do want to make a distinction between universal and symbol. Universal implies symbols where the same symbol is recognized worldwide, whereas global recognizes different languages, cultures, religions, and social settings and environments. We're looking at the nuances that occur in different cultures, but we're not going to suggest and introduce extra symbol sets where we already have symbols that are universally recognized. Just to illustrate the challenge, the issue, if you like, the problem, here are two separate symbols for prayer. Interestingly, they both involve kneeling, but actually in terms of prayer, one from the Western Christian tradition and one from the Islamic tradition, actually, in terms of familiarity, really quite distinctly different. And so when we talk about prayer in this case, we would have to recognize quite a lot of cultural difference that occurs. Let's bring that down to something a little bit more pragmatic. Here we have two symbols for friends. Now, interesting challenge we had here when we talk about cultural relevance is that we were working in originally in Islamic culture. Now, there is nothing offensive about the photo that is on my left. Two men, woman, but that would be very much seen as most likely to represent family, because within the culture when we were working in Qatar and in the Gulf, as friends, you didn't have that level of physical contact between men and women simply as friends. Friends were single-sex groups. And as you can see, when we look at the other one, we have three women still with their arms around each other, still with physical contact, but in this case with their hair covered, but it is a single-sex group. So friends tended to be divided by gender. So our symbol to be, if you like, a symbol to be recognized and to feel familiar had to change. We all know symbols communicate meaning, and those symbols can be at times a little confusing. This was actually symbols that came from a visit to Africa, to Nairobi, in fact. And whilst I was in Nairobi, as you do, I went to the toilet. And these were the symbols on the door. And I genuinely still looked at it for quite some time because I'd become very nervous about walking into the wrong toilet. Eventually, somebody else came up, another man, and I realized that actually I needed to go through the one with the elephant. And I did ask people, why would you have these very strange symbols on a toilet door? And they said, well, you know, the elephant has this long trunk. I think that's clear what that represents. And then they were laughing and they said, well, and giraffes, when they pee, it all sprays out from between their legs in a huge umbrella. So that's the one which we have for women. And somebody else said it as well, because giraffes are very graceful, they said. That was their other example. But it's interesting, symbols communicating meaning. There can be all sorts of cultural norms that we may not anticipate. They can also be really quite nuanced, even in the mainstream, even before we go into AAC. Here, I was actually, the symbol on the left, I was speaking at Asher in Boston last year. And this was the symbol in the hotel, on the hotel door, on the toilet door in the hotel, is the one on the left. And the other one was one which I took from elsewhere. They both are pushing forward an agenda in terms of equality, equity, and so on. But actually, there's quite a lot of nuance and difference between the two. So the one which is a white on blue means that the toilet can be used by anyone, man or woman, and is a universal toilet. That's fine. The one on the left, however, I think has more of a nuance that the toilet is for use by anyone who may or may not identify as a specific gender, or may actually choose to be one or other at different times. So there was a social dimension to that symbol, particularly in the States at the time, which perhaps the white on blue symbol doesn't convey in the same way. And we have to take all of this nuance and idea into account when we talk about symbol design. We need to think about symbol types, the style, the color and outlines, the imagery that's being used, and to some extent formats. So symbol types, we talked earlier, some symbol types are quite universal, they're mainly concrete, and we see lots of them, signs and icons in things like airports and on technology and so on. We then have ideograms. These are more abstract. Bliss symbolics would be a good example of this. And we don't actually, those symbols don't really convey a great deal of variation for language or culture. But when we get into pictographic symbols, then we do have concrete concepts, but we also have abstractions. And these are quite representative, they're quite graphical, and hence they carry much, much more information and unintended information within them. And if we just look at the very wide range of symbols, all related to feeling happy, pictographic styles can be very, very variable. They all convey the same meaning, but actually they are quite distinctly different. So selection of symbols can be quite important. Here we have all sorts of different skin tones. We have some that are more abstract. We have different cultures being represented. Obviously, we have different gender and so on, but all to convey fundamentally the same concept. It's worth remembering when we're choosing symbols that symbols that try to convey nuance by color can be quite confusing. So, for instance, things that we may want to use in the UK to suggest danger, stop, and so on, may not have the same meaning for everybody, or may not convey the same norm. So red in China is a color of happiness. Equally well, white in China is death, and same in Japan, where it's actually more neutral or a color of purity associated with in the US or France. Green has all sorts of meanings for different places. In France, it suggests criminality, whereas in the United States, it's about things are safe, so you can go, and so on. So choosing colors within to convey cultural norms may need to vary quite a bit depending on the audience and the group that you're working with. These add up and then form part of what we would always call schema, the rules and conventions for different symbols with additional elements. So here we have symbols from the Mulberry symbol set. And you can see there are certain norms that emerge here in terms of things like width of line, choice of color, the use of the cross to convey negatives, the blue and the gray to indicate a man, and so on. The apple juice combines a symbol for glass, the juice, with the fruit. So these rules, these conventions, are put in place for different symbol sets. And these are the conventions that we may need to think about in selecting exactly the symbol set for different cultures. I'll give you an example, a really good example of something which seemed simple at the time, but was actually quite complex. We were talking about how do we indicate later or earlier as a symbol? And often, if we take it from in Western culture, because the sun, because we read from left to right, if we were talking about passage of time within a day, the sun often would rise on the left-hand side of the symbol. At noon, it's in the center, and in the evening, when it's setting, it's on the right-hand side of the symbol. However, when we were working in the Middle East and we were talking to people there, they indicated a preference for the symbol to be reversed because they read from right to left. They wanted the symbol to start on the right-hand side and then move in the opposite direction. So the beginning is on the right, the end of the day was on the left, as in the Western tradition, we start on the left and end on the right. So all of these things came out through discussion and review of the design of symbols. We became conscious, so I'm just going to have a quick drink of water, that simple translation of text and words was not always straightforward. And there's probably a classic example from President Carter in 1977. The State Department hired a Russian interpreter who knew Polish, but wasn't used to interpreting professionally. So Carter ended up saying things in Polish for when I abandoned the United States instead of when I left the United States. And rather than saying about people's desires for the future, the interpreter referred to it as your lusts for the future. So again, a little bit of subtlety there and nuance in the translation, and that will be reflected when you come to translate the text or the tag, the label for a symbol that you might be using. There may be some subtlety to be aware of. Equally, we found that core and fringe vocabularies were not the same for every community. The core words, the most commonly words used, relevant across contexts, were not the same when we were working with Arabic speakers, but equally when we were working with people in Pakistan, when we were working with people in the Balkans, the core vocabulary was not quite the same, and particularly the use of the amount of nouns used, adverbs and so on, all changed. And we very much found that the fringe, even more so, may be very personal, and differed hugely between cultures, languages, and were very much specific to activities. Now, the activities change if what people do on a day in, day out, and if foods, for instance, are varied, then the fringe will vary accordingly as well. So let's just take some examples here of some of the cultural factors that we had to take into account. So I talked about one of these earlier about minimized gender mixing in symbol design, but obviously clothing was a major factor. So Catholic females tended to wear the abaya or a niqab or hijab, and the clothing was really quite modest in style. The point was often to cover up, but actually that was also true when we looked at what people found comfortable with the men. Men in shorts, for instance, was not really quite what they did. If you look at men wearing their thobe, they're covered up at the wrists, at the shoulders, at the neck, and right down to the ankles. So this general principle of modest clothing, again, nothing offensive to most people, but certainly familiarity and comfort would mean that we had to change our clothing in the symbols quite significantly. As we said, we minimized gender mixing in symbols, and also just reduced the extent of display of affection with the opposite sex. It was okay for people to be shaking hands, but hugs, kisses between the opposite sex, when we don't know if they're family, related, and so on, was considered a little bit unusual at best. We recognized also in the symbols, physical features were quite important. We wanted to have symbols that reflected the darker complexion and hair color that the majority of the population had. Facial hair for adult male characters. The vast majority of Qatari men grew short beards, not too much skin showing, and actually no real comfort with stick figures. People preferred these to be representative rather than stick figures. Environmental factors, again, things that probably wouldn't surprise you hugely, but you just need to look around the community, around the environment within which the symbols are going to be used. Things like local currency. We were looking at things like parks where children played. And the parks where the majority of the children played were not lush green with trees. They tended to have sand and soft surfaces from rubber or sand on the floor, rather than lots of green grass, mostly because, of course, it was very hot. So keeping green grass watered was very difficult. But we also found that, lots of things like local landmarks, choice of food, cars, many cars. When we were talking to people, lots of people drove quite large cars, and that was a very familiar thing in terms of a private car around Qatar. But actually, in other countries we worked in, for instance, motorbikes were much more popular than cars were because they were a lot cheaper. Foods differed significantly in terms of the amount of salad that people ate, and so on. Pizza was a treat rather than a staple, and so on. You can also find that when you look at houses, the symbol here we have for a traditional sort of house in the West, with two sort of almost like a bungalow or a semi-detached or detached house, whereas families in homes, in shared houses, shared in compounds where 2 or 3 families might live together as they married, and so on. So again, just that difference in style to make it feel like it represented home. Of course, religious factors were everywhere. We were dealing, in this case, within a setting in which faith and religion was really very, very central to what people were doing. So we had to think about, how do we represent holidays, figures, sayings and phrases, and sensitivities. And as you can imagine, one of the big challenges that we had at this time was, how did we represent the symbol for God? And we spent some time working with the Imam in Doha to think about this and to think about how that would best. And it was decided to use the Arabic word in a calligraphic style as something which most people would feel very familiar with. Mosques are different from churches, and so on. We talked about some of the linguistic factors earlier. We had to flip symbols depending on, again, that moving things from right to left. There was very much a need to have male and female versions for each symbol because, like so many languages, the words had a masculine and feminine version. And particularly in Arabic, as an example, again, we were dealing with that actually the plurals, yes, you have one and you have a plural, but you also have a word form for two. So we needed 3 symbols to represent one, two, many, and plurals. Otherwise, it didn't quite make sense when written. So we were working a lot around the democratization of AA symbols, democratization of AAC symbol choices, not just from consultation, but actually involving not just therapists, but AAC users in participatory decision making. as we worked on the development of symbols and the adaptation and enhancement of symbols, we very much followed an open ethos to move to create and share relevant symbols. Without that, you're going to struggle. You have to involve people from within the language community you're there to serve in order to get symbols and to choose symbols that are going to be most relevant. But what I wanted to finish off with was how are we addressing this in the future? So one of the things that Global Symbols recognized, we were working in the Balkans, in Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro. And there were a number of symbols which at that time were drawn from AAC that needed to be adapted to reflect the community within which the symbols were going to be used. And just like it had been when we'd been working in the Middle East, the cost of this was quite significant. And so producing a symbol set that felt familiar to people within those communities was quite expensive. We didn't know exactly how many of those symbols would get used because we were also dealing with issues of distribution of technology, of training and developing skills and capacity building. At the end of that, during that project, UNICEF funded graphic designers to do the drawings, to produce the symbols that were needed. But it was a significant cost to the project. That led us to start to think about the future of symbol design. We currently have a project at the moment which is out for beta testing. And what this project will do is use generative AI to analyze a symbol set. And in that analysis begins to understand the schema that underpins the ways in which symbols are designed. What that then lets you do is to type in a text prompt into a generative AI front end, and it will then produce new symbols to reflect the new symbol that you want. So here's an example. The symbols that were all sorts of symbols in the set. This is a mulberry symbol. So we had a horse, we had cow, different animals. We had a person with a face, and we had a shovel, rake, whatever we wanted to call it. And in this case, this is very early on in our development. We wanted to generate a symbol for a monkey and a shovel in mulberry AAC style. The symbol it generated at that point is the symbol below. I think at that stage, we thought that was a pretty good result for what is quite a strange choice of symbol. But we can also see how some of those issues get applied when we want quite specific symbols. So in this case, there are a lot of symbols here. These are all symbols representing women across the top. The symbol on the left was an Indian woman working as a gardener. The symbol in the center was prompted by a Chinese woman working as a doctor. And the final symbol was for an African woman who is an astronaut. Similarly, we wanted to generate some new symbols for different fruit. So one of the things that we wanted to have a symbol for was a kumquat. And by having symbols in the set that represented other things, we were able to quite quickly generate symbols to reflect a food that perhaps isn't eaten everywhere universally. That's out for beta testing at the moment. And our idea with this will be that ultimately, if you're working with free and open symbols, it will be available for free or cost recovery. However, if you're working with commercial symbols such as PCS and so on, then we would license this to the symbol company to reduce the cost of generating new symbols. Either way, we believe it's going to be an important tool to allow you and others working in the field to create new symbols rapidly, to fill a vocabulary, to reflect language and culture, to represent nuance, to meet the needs of the AAC users that you work with. That's where I'm going to finish, because I think that gives us a few minutes for questions. Let me just close that down and stop sharing.
Thanks, David. That was really, really interesting. Does anybody have any questions you'd like to ask? Oh, very quiet. No, that was excellent, David. It was really interesting. And
do, of course, I mean, I think many of you know Charlie Danger.
Yeah.
He's one of the directors here with us at Global Symbols. Do lock him into a corner and get him to explain more on a slightly more informal basis. And we should be able to. We'll be launching the product at ATAA at the end of January. So there will then, at that point, there'll be a chance for people to try it.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's really interesting to see the AI generative tool to create the symbols. Yeah, that's going to be interesting.
It's interesting. One of the things it's thrown up, Wayne, is that some symbol sets, it's kind of, as you train an AI model, you discover that the consistency of symbol design within that symbol set is not as great as you thought it was. And that really confuses the AI model, that actually over maybe 20 years, the schema has sort of spread. It's not focused. It's not stayed the same. Line widths, use of different signifiers within the symbol have all changed. The AI really throws that up and makes you realize that we're not consistent, particularly when we're talking about 20,000, 30,000 symbols within a vocabulary.
Wow. Cool. Yeah. I can't see any questions in the chat.
That's good, because I probably wouldn't be able to answer them.
Very good. But I guess, yeah, it's all good then. So I guess we can, close it there, unless there's anything else you want to add, David.
No, other than, do keep an eye open. I don't know if anybody will be at ATIA, but I know that we'll be talking about it within the UK as well. Probably things like communication matters. So do keep in touch, and hopefully let us know if there's any particular problems that you have where you're facing challenges with language and culture, and let's see if we can help. That's what we're here for. Brilliant.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you. And thank you for everyone else joining today. And we'll just finish there. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.